My name is Jennifer Goss, and I'm a full-time high school social studies teacher in Stanton, Virginia, where I teach AP US Gov, dual enrollment US History, a Holocaust and Genocide Studies elective, and American Government to seniors. I also adjunct at Blue Ridge Community College, teaching both US and world history, and am a 2010 United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Teacher Fellow. Holocaust education is a really big part of my life, and I'm privileged to get the opportunity to normally, in non-COVID times, travel around the country and work with educators such as yourselves. I really look forward to resuming that normalcy at some point in time, although I did enjoy having a slightly calmer summer in some ways, in the ability of not traveling and being on an airplane 2 and 3 times a week. So that is one kind of COVID silver lining that I've embraced this summer, but I do miss the actual interaction with individuals and getting the opportunity to go out and visit different places. Was looking at my Facebook today and noticed that 3 years ago today I was in Tulsa and had the opportunity to tour the area of Tulsa that had been ruined by the race riots in 1929, and also the ability to, 1921, and also the ability to reflect in Reconciliation Park. So it was, definitely a memory that meant a lot to me to look back on, especially in light of where our summer has gone. Echoes and Reflections has been around since 2005, and our primary goal is to support middle school and high school educators to teach their students about the Holocaust by providing materials that get students to think critically about this content and its meaning in their lives and the world today. And to date, we've worked with over 70,000 educators around the United States. To get us started in thinking about today's work and what we're doing and where we're kind of going with all of this, I had asked you to go to Menti, and I know many of you are familiar with Menti. It's a free tool that allows you to create a word cloud, to have your students answer open-ended questions, to have them answer multiple choice questions, etc. And I thought, being as that our topic today is refugees, it would be really interesting to look at the mix of places that our families come from. And I see that Ireland has taken the lead with our current group here, with Germany and Switzerland in second place, and the United States as well. And then we also see representation of Spain, Scotland, Mexico, Denmark, the UK, Bohemia, and I think I hit all of the countries on our list. And so, one of the things that I get my students thinking about is, when we're talking about the concept of refugees to this nation, where do different families come from? And how does that shape their experiences, both historically and in the present day? So I want to take us back now to the experience of a specific family. And this was a family that was in Europe during the time of the Holocaust. And the gentleman who is the writer of the letter is a European Jew who is writing to a friend in the United States. And so I'm going to share that letter with you now. And what I'd like to do is to have you take a moment as I'm reading through the letter, and just take a look at what you notice about it. So the letter was written on April 30th, 1941, and it begins, "Dear Charlie, I am forced to look out for immigration, and as far as I can see, USA is the only country we could go to. Perhaps you remember that we have 2 girls. It is for the sake of children mainly that we have to care for. Our own fate is of less importance. 2 brothers of Edith immigrated last year, and they work as ordinary workmen around Boston. Both of them earn money, but not enough to have us come. They would be able to give an affidavit for their mother living with us here, and they saved enough, as far as I can make out, to pay for the passage for my mother-in-law. In 1938, I filed an application in Rotterdam to emigrate to USA, but all the papers have been destroyed there. The dates of application are of no importance any longer, as anyone who has an effective affidavit from a member of his family and who can pay his passage may leave. One says that no special difficulties shall be made from the part of the German authorities, but in the case that an affidavit from family members is not available or not sufficient, the consul asks for a bank deposit. How much he would ask in my case, I don't know. I'm not allowed to go to Rotterdam, and without an introduction, the consul would not even accept me. As far as I hear from other people, it might be about $5,000 for us four. You are the only person that I can ask. Would it be possible for you to give a deposit in my favor? So looking at this letter, what are some initial impressions that you have? If you can go ahead and share them in the chat box, or even if you want, since we have such a small group, if you'd like to unmute your mic, I would certainly be happy to call on you to share out loud. But what are some initial impressions that you get in reading this letter? Any thoughts? Like as you're reading through it, as you were listening to it. Right, Shane mentions it sounds like a confusing bureaucratic process, intimidating and overwhelming. Christy mentions desperation and acceptance. Out of curiosity, has anyone ever seen this letter before? Right, Gabriel mentions opportunities for the wealthy. Okay. Who do we think that Charlie might be to the person who is writing the letter writer? It's Laquita. I don't want to mispronounce your name. I'm so sorry. And if you don't mind unmuting your mic and telling me how to pronounce it, I would greatly appreciate it.
You have it just right.
Oh, perfect. Okay, great. And it's similar to immigration challenges today. Monica's saying maybe a cousin, right? Any other thoughts on who? All right, well, I will go ahead and share with you. Does anybody actually know or suspect who the letter writer could be? I'm not seeing any guesses, so I'm going to go ahead and share. This letter was written by Otto Frank. Oh, and Christy's got it. Yeah, this letter was written by Otto Frank. It was written to his college roommate, who was Mr. Nathan Strauss of the Macy's family. And so Nathan went by the name Charlie. That was his nickname. And it basically, shows that Otto and his family are trying to get out. He and Strauss, obviously being college roommates, knew each other very well. In fact, Otto Frank had worked at Macy's in New York between 1908 and 1909 and had planned to stay there, but had to return to Germany to care for his ailing father. And so his efforts to leave Germany were not unlike other European Jewish refugees in the 1930s and 40s. We just happen to know, reading this letter, how his specific story is going to end because of course, the nature of the story behind Anne Frank's diary. And so while each story is unique, what binds them together is both the urgency and the struggles of European Jews escaping during a time when other countries' doors were closing, including the United States. And so we're going to be looking at this letter, talking about components of this letter throughout the training to help contextualize and make real for ourselves and for our students the plight of Jewish refugees during this time period. Although I don't yet have the link live in our working document, in just a short while, I'm going to transition to making it live so that you all have access to it. I'm also going to provide you with some additional information in that working document to a USHMM link on the Americans in the Holocaust exhibition component that features Otto Frank. Unfortunately, the story of Otto Frank and so many other Jews during this time period is not unlike what is happening today. You can see the numbers here that at the end of World War I, there were approximately 60 million people total that had been counted as displaced during the war and in the post-war period. When the war actually concluded and things had time to settle down a little bit, approximately 7 to 9 million displaced persons remained, and approximately 250,000 of them were Jewish. Comparing to today, at the end of 2019, in a report that was just issued last month by the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, there are now nearly 80 million displaced people worldwide. And of those 80 million people, 30.2 million of them are refugees and asylum seekers. This number has gone up 11 million in the past year, and the number of refugees and asylum seekers alone has gone up 6 million. Those numbers are astounding and often very challenging for us to talk about with our students and in some of the communities that we teach in. Some of us have students in our classroom who themselves are refugees. Some of us have people that are close to us. Some of us may ourselves be refugees. Some of us may have family members who are. And so it's a very difficult and challenging topic. And so my hope throughout the next couple of days is that we can take an understanding of the Jewish refugee plight in the 1930s and 1940s, which is an important topic in and of itself, and make connections to help us understand the current refugee crisis, both those who are fleeing and how the world is responding to their flight. And how the world is responding is challenging. It's something that we probably all know as adults with social media. You know, the responses are unfortunately all over the map, and even within our own networks of contacts that we have, there's a lot of disagreement. But there's no doubt, and Ban Ki-moon, the former UN Secretary General, said it so well as, you know, in 2016, which now seems like so long ago, we're facing the biggest refugee and displacement crisis.
Hello, hello. Oh, think she'll have to get back in. Have you all seen this article I'm posting right now about the Dominican Republic taking in refugees while 31 nations looked away? And there's a corresponding radio from PRI. As we wait for Jennifer. There she comes. Correct about the humanitarian reasons.
I talk with my hands. I'm not Italian, but I talk with my hands, and I like hit the button on my computer, so my apologies. All right, so let me get my screen back up. Hang on one second.
No worries.
I'm obviously very passionate about this. So I left off, I was saying, Ban Ki-moon saying, we're facing the biggest crisis of our time. And what was particularly interesting about the latter part of his statement is he's noting that it's not just a crisis of numbers. It's not just at that time when he was talking 64 million displaced persons. It is a crisis of solidarity. It's a crisis of how we're going to deal with these issues. And, it's there that we're going to be looking at how did the global community respond in the 1930s and how did we respond today? And so I've chosen to share with you some quotes that are a few years in the past, some even further back. And my rationale behind this is when I have conversations with my students, first of all, I mentioned this, I think, in our previous webinar, I find it easier to have a discussion about a difficult topic that happened in the past that my students may not necessarily have a direct connection to. We have a very small Jewish community in the town where I teach, and so my students don't have personal connections to the Holocaust. But then I build a foundation with them that brings them into the present, where they can talk more freely and feel like they have a little bit more of the foundation and the structure to talk about these difficult topics. And so I pulled this particular quote from Paul Ryan originally when we created this presentation, decided to keep it because ironically, some of my students today don't even know who Paul Ryan is, which is shocking because it's only just a couple of years ago, but Kristen knows, she gets it. But it also, there's just that little bit of distance there, whereas if I bring in Nancy Pelosi or I bring in Mitch McConnell, my students are going to have a much more visceral reaction. And so I share with them that this particular quote came in the immediate aftermath of the discussion of allowing in Syrian refugees following the November 2015 terrorist attacks in Paris. And I'm sure, we all probably know where we were and what we were doing when those things happened. But, the attacks on a concert hall, a major stadium, restaurants and bars left 130 people dead. And ISIS took, ownership and responsibility for those attacks. And of course, this is in the midst of the world dealing with the Syrian refugee crisis. And there was so much misinformation, like the Syrian passport being found at the scenes of one of the terror attacks, which was actually a faked passport because all of the terrorists were EU citizens. And so nonetheless, in the aftermath of this, many members of Congress sought to halt the Syrian refugee program, fearing that fighters from the Islamic State could be among the 10,000 refugees that at that time the Obama administration was, hoping to and eventually did allow to come into this country. And so we talk about this, and sometimes students will, ask, okay, well, what political party was Paul Ryan from? And then they'll have some type of stereotypical reaction based on, the response of him being a member of the Republican Party. And then, we get to this. Well, okay, this is Paul Ryan in 2015, but what about this? Now, of course, the refugee has got to be checked because unfortunately, among the refugee, there are some spies. Here we have a quote from 1940 from a Democratic US president. And so it shows us that these schisms in solidarity are not new. And I always say to my students, we want to make connections. We don't want to make comparisons. We want to acknowledge that each generation has its challenges, and that unfortunately in our world society, many different groups of people have been marginalized, have been placed into refugee situations, and then have had to deal with stereotypes that make their refugee situations even worse. So at this time in the 1930s and 1940s, such sentiments were fueled by many in the government, particularly the State Department, which had its own issues with Jewish refugees, as well as a fear of a so-called fifth column of spies. And so taking these quotes from Roosevelt and Ryan, we can see that these two leaders' comments reflect the tensions between national security and addressing the refugee crisis, something that is still, haunting us in 2020. Many argue that concerns for terrorists were misplaced at the expense of those fleeing for their lives, but others will say that, terrorism is a real issue and it's something that we have had to deal with in our own nation. So what is the right response? And then to additionally complicate matters, back in the 1940s, the United States actually had no category for refugees. They had no refugee-specific policy during this era. A refugee was considered just the same as any other individual who hoped to apply for immigration into the United States. And of course, as many of you know, as teachers of US history, the Immigration Act of 1924, aka the Johnson-Reed Act, was incredibly restrictive, and it made no exceptions. And even when individuals were coming here on situations, like I came back in through the chat box and saw something about the St. Louis as I was coming back into the room, there were no exceptions made for people in those types of situations. And so it was very, very difficult. So we can look at these quotes from government officials and we can say, okay, yeah, but we need to make the story more human. We need to get our students thinking about the impact of this situation on individuals that are refugees, that are in a situation that they need to escape. And so I want to share with you first this quote from Inga Sedan. Inga was a Jewish refugee during the era of the Holocaust. She would survive thanks in part to the fact that her parents placed her on the kinder transport. The kinder transport, as many of you probably already know, was a journey of 10,000 children that were sent to England, and they were sent to England without their parents. They were sent there specifically to be put either with foster families, to be put in hostels, to be put in orphanages. And it was a decision that was very difficult for a parent to make. I mean, I have a 6-year-old daughter, and I absolutely could not imagine putting her in a situation where she was going to go to another country, which was very unlike the country that we were living in, and then on top of that, not knowing what would happen to her, and myself, if we would ever be reunited. And in the case of many kinder, they were not. And so Inga says, to be a refugee is the most horrible feeling because you lose your family, you lose your home, you're also without an identity. Suddenly, you are a nothing. You are just reliant on other people's good nature and help and understanding. Aileen, 2016, a refugee in Burundi, says, a refugee is a person who does not have any options. A refugee's life is reliant only on help. I don't feel good being a refugee. We don't have a good place to live. If I had a good place to live, I would have some peace back in my life. So I'd like you to think a moment about those two quotes, about the quote from Inga and about the quote from Aileen. Just think for a moment, reflect on them, and then try and think of one word. If you had to come up with one word that comes to mind when you hear the word refugee, what would that one word be? Think of one word that comes to mind. And here we have two different people, two different times, two different home countries, and yet very similar feelings. So what one word would you come up with? And then I have a different Menti code. One of the downsides of Menti is you can only have 3 slides in a free version. So I now have a different Menti code. And keep this one handy because we're going to be using this one today, tomorrow, and Wednesday. All right, so go to menti.com. And then you can open a new tab, or you could even do it on your phone. And I see some words popping up in the chat box, but if you guys can add them to the Menti code on the screen, what is that word that comes to mind oops, and I just realized I didn't flip my screen. What is that word that comes to mind when you hear the word refugee? So menti.com and the code 935655. What comes to mind? Thinking about those quotes. Again, two different people, two different times, two different home countries, and yet very similar feelings of helplessness. And it's important for our students to know that people do not seek out to become refugees. They don't want to leave their homes. They don't want to risk their lives and their families' lives unless there's no other choice. History can give us some insight of how refugees are experiencing their plight today and how individuals and institutions have responded. History can help us and our students make sense of the situation today to some degree and can provide us with some lessons and important reminders. However, I do want to caution that we're not saying that the current refugee plight and the circumstances surrounding these particular refugees in our current global crisis are the same as those faced by Jews during the Holocaust. We're not comparing, but what we're saying is the fate of Jewish refugees in the 1930s and 40s can serve as a cautionary tale of indifference, inaction, and intolerance. And so we're looking to find connections. So let's see what words come to mind. Okay. So desperate is one that more than one of you thought of. And then I also see difficulty, alone, trauma, lost, frightened, and overwhelming. Okay, and so we'll be coming back to this specific mentee in just a little while, and we'll be adding some additional words to that experience. But now I want to share our goals for today, and you'll see here that we have 5. We're really kind of in many ways looking at the question, why didn't the Jews leave Germany and Europe in general during this time period? It's a common question that many students ask. And underneath that question are many assumptions and attitudes, so that the resources that we're going to highlight in this workshop over the course of the next 3 days are going to help you answer that question. We're going to mainly be focusing on Germany and later Austria and occupied Sudetenland, not other countries. So we're really looking at the fact, as well, and thinking that 90% of the European Jews did not live in the Third Reich prior to World War II, and were not subjected to Nazi policies until their area came under Nazi occupation. And therefore, the immigration policies that we're examining were irrelevant to individuals in those areas, other than the fact that we know that the Johnson-Reed Act was restrictive as well on European Jews in Eastern Europe. And we're looking at what echoes and reflections, materials related to the plight of Jewish refugees can help you as educators connect to today's refugee crisis. So we're looking at this kind of practical question of how we can on-ramp students to current events in a way that can provide them with those foundational skills that I mentioned to, come up with ways of bridging your students into these difficult conversations. And so we'll be tackling these 5 goals. And throughout the course of the presentation, other questions may come up, and I'm certainly going to welcome you to think about other challenges that you may have, because we've got a great network of individuals. And Gabriel and I also encourage you to utilize conversations on Twitter and Facebook, also talk about how to tackle this really challenging topic. So one of the ways that we work to tackle difficult topics, and in particular the difficult topic of teaching about the Holocaust, is through our pedagogical principles. And those of you that were with us for last month's PD certainly have seen these principles before. And so we're going to, look at defining terms. We're going to define terms related to the Holocaust and the refugee crisis. We have some kind of bonus definitions that you'll get as a participant in this training. We will be looking at anti-Semitism, because the refugee groups that we're going to talk about specific to the Holocaust were Jewish refugees. You're going to learn a little bit about why they had to flee their home countries and how Nazism made their particular situations difficult. As always, we'll be providing historical context and using primary sources, and of course, focusing on the human stories, getting students to think about the impact of these events in history on actual human beings, because that not only helps to foster empathy and encourage critical thinking, but it can also help to make the Holocaust relevant to our students. A lot of times students will ask, why am I learning about this? And we'll be talking about different strategies for that in our next couple of sessions. And then lastly, we want to ensure a supportive learning environment for our students. And so with that, what I'd like to invite you to do right now is you'll see in our working document at the top of, I believe it is page 5, if things didn't get too skewed, you will see our pedagogical principles. You'll see a linkage to them, but you'll also see another Menti code. This is, again, the first Menti code that we used. I'd like you to take a moment and just review those pedagogical principles. And I'll put the link to those pedagogical principles in the chat box as well. But they will also be on the Menti. And I'd like you to think about which of these pedagogical principles you feel like you are really good at this point in time. And then which of these pedagogical principles over the course of our work in the next few days that you would really like to focus on. I've now changed the Menti to self-paced, so you should be able to answer both of those questions without having to wait for me to pace the Menti forward. So I'm going to go ahead and give you about a minute, half, 2 minutes to do that. And I just realized that I might not, I think it should be working. Yep, it is working for you guys. All right, I just was thinking I didn't advance it forward, but we're good. So go ahead and take a moment and do that self-reflection. All right, we'll take about 30 more seconds. Pedagogical principle that you think is your strongest is using primary sources, although we also see encouraging critical thinking and teaching the human story. And then the one that many of us want to work on today is fostering empathy. And so that's one I think that's definitely a challenge. It's one that I know I'm particularly concerned about in our virtual environment that we're going to be approaching as we head back to school. And so I think, you know, the quotes that we've looked at already have helped us to think about different ways we can engage in fostering empathy. But we will also, of course, continue that exploration and discussion as we look at the content. So we're now going to move over to the Echoes and Reflections website here in just a moment. But I think it's important for us before we make that shift to have a baseline in some key terms that we are talking about. In the link in our working document, you will see a link to a handout. It's a very nice handout that can be shared with students. It's easily reproducible both digitally and in a traditional print format. And so you'll have the ability to either use the link that I'm providing and share it through your learning management system, or you can also print it out and share it in your classrooms for those of you that will be doing face-to-face instruction. I also apologize. My daughter is apparently killing a fly in the background and very stressed out about this. A refugee. What is a refugee? This is a term that we often hear misused in the news, but by the definition of the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, a refugee is a person who is specifically fleeing armed conflict or persecution. Refugees can originate as asylum seekers. However, not every single individual who ultimately gets refugee status actually begins as an asylum seeker. So a really good way to delineate between these two is a refugee is a person who seeks this status legally before they actually flee their country. An asylum seeker is a person who crosses a border, then seeks international protection and refugee status. And so an asylum seeker can come before a refugee in some cases, or an individual can get refugee status and never actually be an asylum seeker. And then we also have migrants, and we've heard this term used in positive and negative fashions in the media and government terminology over the course of the past few years. But a migrant's a person who moves from one country to another for reasons that do not include war or persecution. Traditionally, there are economic motivations. Sometimes there's familial motivations, but migrants are individuals who would not be classified as refugees or asylum seekers. So as I mentioned, back in 1933, in Nazi Germany and in the years between 1933 and 1945, the concepts of refugees and asylum seekers did not yet exist. That's a designation that the United Nations, which doesn't, of course, exist in this time period, will not create until the post-war era. But that doesn't mean that these individuals that lived in Germany and then eventually Nazi-occupied Europe were not put into situations that would have classified them as refugees had that status existed at that time. So what I'd like to do in the latter part of our program today is I'd like to get us thinking a little bit about what life was like for these people and how it evolved into a situation where they needed to make a change, and that would put them into a status that today we would recognize as that of a refugee. And so I'm now taking you to the Echoes and Reflections homepage. Again, this is going to be a little bit of a refresher for those of you that were with us last time or who have previously done an Echoes and Reflections training. I've again put the URL to Echoes and Reflections in the chat box, but we're going to be heading into the Teach section of Echoes and Reflections. Teach is really the heart and soul of our content. We have a great audio glossary here, which gives us the ability to see the answers to definitions that our students may be seeking while they're studying this content in our classrooms. You can take and clip the URL at the top of the screen and insert it or pin it into whatever learning management system that you're using, so your students have access to this terminology while they are studying the Holocaust. What is also great about it is that you have the ability to sound out words that you might not be familiar with or your students might not be familiar with. So if you've always wondered about how to say Majdanek, you now have the ability to practice before faking it in front of your students, as many of us did for years prior to hearing those words properly pronounced. We also have our timeline, which we'll be taking a look at a little bit later on in this program. But for today, we're going to go into our lesson plans. And so we have 11 different units. You could begin teaching the first and teach all the way through to present day with contemporary anti-Semitism step by step. or since many of us are on a tighter time crunch, you would just go through and pick and choose content that works best for you in your classroom. So this is Unit 2, Anti-Semitism. Every unit begins with an opening quote. In this case, it's that of Henry Sinison, who some of us met during the last training. We have aligned key words. We have background information on the unit to prepare to teach it. So if you're a veteran educator who hasn't taught the topic in a while, or if you're a new educator that's unfamiliar with the topic, you would click on View More, and you get a lot of different additional background information on it. We have video toolboxes for many of our lessons, which give educators background on the specific topic of the lesson, as well as strategies to use to teach it. These video toolboxes are primarily geared to educators, not to students, just a heads up on that. For those of you that are teaching in Common Core states, we have our Common Core alignments. We also provide you with objectives. We'll talk a little bit more in just a moment about the testimony and asset resource guides, and then we have our lesson plans with the aligned content to support the lesson plans down the right-hand side of the page. At the very bottom of every lesson, we have what we call our reflect and respond questions, which are great for journaling and class discussion, work well in a digital environment as well. And then we have our Making Connections extension activities, which can also be used to supplement or even to replace specific components of the lessons as you see fit. And then going up through, I'm going to now take us to a testimony that some of you were with us before, you've met Margaret Lambert, but she is one of my favorite testimonies. And she's going to talk a little bit about what her life was like prior to the Nazi rise to power. And so as we're listening to her testimony, I just want you to think about Margaret, what she's telling us, and what she's sharing with us, how it impacts you. Every testimony has what we call a bio brief, which is just a little bit of background on the individual who's speaking. In our case, it tells us that Margaret was born in 1914 in Laufheim, Germany, and she was successful in fleeing the United States to the United States in 1937. Margaret is one of the older survivors that's utilized in the Echoes and Reflections testimonies. Most of the survivors are close in age to that of our students, and that was an intentional decision. But Margaret's testimony is very powerful and I think will resonate with our students in many ways. So again, we're going to be listening to Margaret and thinking about what her life was like prior to the Nazi rise to power.
I had a wonderful time. I had my mother and father, and I had an older brother, about 2 years older than I. And once we got over the sibling rivalry, we got to be very good friends, my brother and I. And my parents found out pretty soon that what Margaret wanted, Margaret got. And they let me be my own, because I was not the usual child. But I had my own way of dressing. I didn't like what my mother got for me. I wouldn't wear it. And I was strong-willed. And I knew what I wanted to do very early on in life. I wanted to be a coach, physical education teacher. My parents thought I was a little freaky with all this business about sports that I was so very into. I skated, I skied, I swam, I ran, I climbed. Through my sport activities, there were more non-Jewish people involved than Jewish people. I was the only girl in my class. I was the only Jew in my class, and it never made any difference. I mean, I never felt any anti-Semitism until a certain time. I always knew I was Jewish, but our house, there was no religion practiced, really. I always say, my father said, be a decent human being, that should be your religion, and I think I have practiced that, pretty much.
Okay, so thinking of what Margaret shared with us, what I would like you to do now is to head back to Menti, and we're going to go back to the code that we used the first time. which was the one when we were thinking about refugees, or actually it would have been the second one, but I'm going to add the code in the chat box now. And in one word, I'd like you to respond to Margaret's testimony. In one word, I'd like you to respond to this piece of Margaret's testimony. So menti.com, and then the code is 935655. Oh, thank you, Kristen, for telling me I'm muted. I was telling everybody that you could click on Margaret's bio here, and it gives you the more full biography on Margaret, which you can also look in a cleaner printable version that you can share with students and read all about her amazing life. She was an outstanding track and field athlete. She should have been on the 1936 Olympic team, but due to anti-Semitism in Germany, was not able to have that experience. But she did eventually emigrate to the United States and won a track and field championship there, and met and married a fellow athlete who would become an army doctor, and she was a war bride, and she lived at the ripe old age of 103. She just passed away 3 years ago. Last week actually was her last week. So just a little bit more information on her, and you can clip the URL, send it to a student, have them introduce the featured guest speaker to the class. And that's another way to promote student engagement, even in a virtual setting. I'm now going to navigate back to the Echoes page and show you how you can access Margaret's other testimony in a different fashion. So Margaret's second testimony, I know just from utilizing Echoes, is in Unit 3. So I could go over here to the left-hand side. I could click on Unit 3, Nazi Germany, and go from there. But if I just told you there's another Margaret testimony, what you could also do is go to the testimony video guide, which lists the over 6 testimonies that are available in Echoes and Reflections. You could go in here, you could type her name, do the good old Control F and say, okay, first one we know was in anti-Semitism. We click on it again, and here she is in the Nazi Germany unit. And if we click on the topic, and this tells us the topic, the time, the speaker, and the location of every testimony in Echoes, it will also take us directly to her testimony, which is super handy. And yeah, I apologize, guys. My 6-year-old daughter is home today, and since we were away for 7 weeks, she's trying to get every toy imaginable, so I muted myself. So I'm going to now put on Margaret's second piece of testimony. As you are listening to this testimony, I want you to, again, think of a word that stands out in your mind about her experience, and also particularly thinking about how her life has changed as a result of the Nazi rise to power. And so here is Margaret's second piece of testimony.
It started in 1933, really. But I had very good friends of whom I knew that they were members of the Nazi Party since 1928. And she was one of my best friends. She didn't care that I was Jewish, and I didn't care that she was a Nazi. She was one of my sports friends, and we got along very well. But then, of course, in 1933, everything changed. Like overnight, you could not go into a public place, no restaurants, no swimming pools, no movies, nothing. You were not allowed in any public place anymore. And the people that you knew wouldn't talk to you anymore. Friends that you had, they would shun you, most of them. Not because they hated us all of a sudden, but they were all afraid, because that was the way it was. You talk to a Jew and you'll be punished. It was very hard. I was 19 years old, and all of a sudden I was shut off from everything. I got a letter from my sports club in Ulm that I wasn't welcome there anymore because I was Jewish, and that was the thing that I loved to do most, as I said before, sports. And all of a sudden that was finished. There was nothing I could do. We just were really vegetating, if you want to call it that. So.
Okay, so now back to the mentee. And another word that stands out to you regarding Margaret's second piece of testimony. So mentee.com, code 935655. And a word that stands out in your mind after listening to that piece of testimony. Okay, so confused, heartbroken, change, cruelty, isolated. Confused and heartbroken are two that stand out. One of the things that you can do, if again, if you have the free version of Mentee, you kind of have to try some tricks. You can do a snip of your screen. And I'm now going to do a full screen share of my resources. I've gone back to Margaret's original testimony, which you can see. And now I'm going to do a full screen share. And I'm going to put the first testimony from Margaret on the left, your results of it. I can manipulate these the way I want to. And then the second responses are on the right. And so you can take and share these two word clouds with your students and just have them look, what's the difference? On the left, we see she's innocent, carefree, determined, strong-willed, sheltered, strong, and young. And then on the right, we see confused, heartbroken, isolated, cruelty, and change. So a very unfortunate shift in Margaret's experience. And this was not, a shift that was unlike that of other Jews that were experiencing life at this time. For many, their Jewish identity, while important, was not their singular identity. Well, anti-Semitism existed in Europe, and Germany was still highly civilized with equal rights for Jews, and Jews saw themselves deeply connected to Germany. Many were proud to be German. And approximately 100,000 Jewish citizens fought for Germany during World War I and demonstrated their loyalty by defending the country. Approximately 12,000 were even killed in action. And the total number of Jewish Germans at this time was 550,000, meaning that 20% of that particular population fought in the Great War, making them the most overrepresented of all groups in Germany. And so through their action, they demonstrated great support for their country. And it's very difficult for them to think about leaving. And so many students will just say, well, why didn't they just leave? And so we're going to close today by just taking a look at 3 sets of immigration rates. Between 1933, in the year 1933, right after Hitler came to power in those months, 37,000 to 38,000 Jews left Germany. In the 1938 year of immigration, 36,000 left Germany and Austria. In 1939, that number jumps to 77,000. So your assignment for tonight is to think about the why. I encourage you to check out the Echoes and Reflections timeline if you have the opportunity to do so, and I'll put the link for that in our chat box, and think about the why. And that is where we will start our conversation tomorrow, is what changes between 1938 and 1939 that is going to prompt a near doubling of the amount of people that are going to want to leave Nazi Germany. So thank you guys for your attention today, and your flexibility with my minor technical challenge there at one point. I look forward to seeing you same time, same place tomorrow. If anybody has any lingering questions, please feel free to post them in the chat box. But otherwise, we will see you at 1 p.m. tomorrow. And Gabriel, thank you again for having me this afternoon.
Thank you very much, and looking forward to tomorrow.
See you guys then.
See ya.